this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And my very special guest today is Leonard Goldberg. He is just amazing. He's an international best-selling author, and I will let him tell you all about that. But I am so excited for so many reasons because, Leonard, you are the man of my dreams. I love you. I'm so happy to have you here. I can't believe it's book 8 of A Daughter of Sherlock Holmes mystery series. My goodness, the years have gone so quickly. But I have been reading you for just about forever. And I feel like it's forever because I first read this book, Transplant.
Wow.
And I am so mad at myself. Now, at one point I had 6,000 books, and then I moved, and so I had to cut it down. And I got rid of my paperback books. I donated them to a charity where they did a big sale, made lots of money because I gave almost 3,000 paperback books. Unfortunately, I gave this book, which now I understand is selling for $99. You can't buy.
You can't find it. Yeah.
I mean, it's so sad. I'm so sorry I sold it. Because that really broke you into the whole book world.
It did.
It did. It made a big splash. Now, one of the reasons, of course, I love that book. I don't remember the exact year, but I used to be a medical technician. So that book particularly interested me, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about that. Why a med tech, who's one of my jobs was taking blood samples and discovering blood types. So when you wrote this book, and I remember when it came out, and I was on a trip actually. That's why I had a paperback. Tell us about it, because you were a doctor, and you went from being a doctor, and you wrote this first book, Transplant, which just, yeah. I don't remember how fast it went to the bestseller list, but it was a big thing at the time.
The story behind it is rather interesting. At the time, I was at UCLA training in blood diseases, and we had this patient who was making antibodies against her own red blood cells. So if you gave her transfusion, she immediately destroyed those red blood cells because most of the antibodies are against the Rh factor. And it looked pretty hopeless. She was not doing well at all. Then we read about a family that was born without any Rh factors. So we immediately looked them up, found a member of the family who was type O and no Rh factors. That meant the patient was devoid of factors A, B, and all Rh factors. So we got a unit of blood from that person and gave it to the patient, and she tolerated it beautifully. So we were on our way. We could hold the patient in good stead until the drugs took effect and she could go on her way. The interesting part of the story was that as I was writing up this patient for discharge summary, it occurred to me, what if somebody was born who had no transplant antigens? None. Then that person would be a universal donor. Anybody could receive one of her organs without any fear of rejection. So I invented this character, a young woman who was born without any histocompatibility in terms of, gee, I'm going to be a writer. I just enjoyed doing it. It was an interesting story. But then it went through 8 or 9 reprints, and suddenly I was addicted.
Exactly. That's why I named this program Joy on Paper, because once you see your writing, once you write something and you see it on paper, it is addictive. It just makes you feel so good and you can't stop. And you definitely haven't stopped. So that was back in, when it was, the year was what?
In the 80s.
In the 1980s. It's incredible. It's hard to believe it's been so many years ago since I read it, but you've written a lot of books since, and a lot of different types of books. But when you came out with this idea for The Daughter of Sherlock Holmes, I just fell in love with this series. It is mine really because of all the periods in history, World War I is one of my favorites. One, because I'm a fanatic about Winston Churchill. That was when he was young, and I read everything about Winston Churchill. And then I just love all the stories about World War I. Oh, just tell us how you came out with this brilliant idea. By the way, I should add, in addition to being a doctor, Len is you're a physicist. What else are you?
That's it.
That's it?
I never got a degree in physics, but somehow that slipped in. So I asked them to take it out, but they said, no, you've had some training in that, so we'll
Yeah,
leave
yeah,
it.
you're a physicist. You're a genius. That's what I'm calling you. You're a genius.
Ah,
And
well, thank you for that.
tell us about this one, because when to come out, over the years they've had different people have looked at Sherlock Holmes in different ways, but your take on it and coming out with his daughter is brilliant, and then you've just run with it.
Actually, the idea for a daughter of Sherlock Holmes came when I was reading one of Arthur Conan Doyle's Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, entitled A Scandal in Bohemia. And let me tell you briefly what the Scandal in Bohemia was about. One night at 221B Baker Street, there's a knock on the door, and in walks the King of Bohemia with a very delicate problem. It seems the king is now engaged to the daughter of the King of Scandinavia, and a June wedding is planned. But there's a problem, because his former lover, Irene Adler, the famous opera star, has photographs of she and the king in rather scandalous positions. And she threatens to release those photographs unless he comes back to her, which of course he doesn't want to do. He pleads with her, he offers her great amounts of money, but she's not interested. She's an opera star. She doesn't need his money. In desperation, the king comes to see Sherlock Holmes and says, obtain those photographs for me. I will pay you any amount if you can do it. Sherlock says fine and goes about it, but he fails. Irene Adler outwits him at every step of the way. Now, Sherlock has been outwitted by 4 people, 3 men, only 1 woman, Irene Adler. So at the end of this tale, Sherlock has failed and admits it. And Irene Adler writes him a letter of farewell, goodbye, and so the story ends. As I read that, I thought to myself, wait a minute. Just suppose Sherlock had a romantic encounter with Irene Adler. Had these 2 people with wonderful brains, deductive reasoning. If they were to have a child, why, that child might turn out to be absolutely brilliant. But a problem arises here, because Sherlock is a cold-hearted fella. He doesn't believe in love and romance. He wants nothing to do with it. According to John Watson, the reason for this is that Holmes believes that love or any emotion will interfere with his finely tuned brain. So he stays away from women and affairs altogether. So how do you get around this? I had to make up another little story, which I think you will enjoy. Irene Adler, after the episode in which she outwitted Sherlock Holmes, meets and marries a London lawyer, Godfrey Norton. She's madly in love. They move to Paris, where they will enjoy a life of ecstasy and romance. But all does not turn out well for Irene, because she learns she's married a scoundrel. He's a gambler, a womanizer. He has a string of mistresses. The only time he's ever home is when he needs money, for she continues to be an opera star. But the worst part of all is that Godfrey Norton is a dullard. He's dull. He can't even carry on a decent conversation. So here we have this brilliant woman with this marvelous deductive mind, and she's stuck with a bore, a dullard. Life is terrible for her, just terrible. Well, one night there's another knock on the door at 221B Baker Street. Sherlock opens the door. Watson is now married and moved out. And standing before him is Irene Adler. And she gets right to the point. She tells Sherlock, I'm married to a bore. He's so dull, it's incredible. My mind requires stimulation. It requires puzzles to be solved. And you're the only person I knew can survive, who can provide them. Holmes welcomes her in, and they have a delightful evening, creating crimes, solving puzzles, just magnificent. They drink glass after glass of brandy. They inject one another with cocaine, and they end up in bed together. The next morning, Holmes awakens. Irene Adler's gone. No note of goodbye, no farewell, gone. Holmes is delighted. He wants no affair. He wants no romance. Besides, there's a murder in Belgravia he has to pay attention to. And that is how the Daughter of Sherlock Holmes was conceived.
And so we have Joanna, who has led you down a merry, merry path of many books, many books. This is now book 8, and it started
Yes.
with The Daughter of Sherlock Holmes. And maybe we'll talk a little bit later about book 7, because The Wayward Prince is absolutely one of my favorites. So it all starts with our wonderful, and we owe him so much, all the reading world owes him so much, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle. Wow, he really started something big that everybody's run with since, right?
Oh, just remarkable. Sherlock Holmes is the most frequently portrayed person on television and in movies than any other character. No one even comes close.
I love him.
Think about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, everybody.
I know.
And the interesting thing to me, or the fascinating thing to me, is this fellow wrote about Sherlock Holmes 100 years ago. Yet today, 100 years later, Sherlock Holmes is the most famous detective in the world.
Exactly. And
Unbelievable.
It is so fantastic. And I have walked actually in the footsteps of Conan Doyle, because I was in Edinburgh a lot, and of course that's where he was born. And
Yes.
people don't realize not only was he born there, but another great writer, Robert Louis Stevenson, was born there.
Of course.
So I've had a great interest in both of them over the years. Now, have you gone to Edinburgh to step in where they were born?
I went to Edinburgh, but not for that reason. I did a year of research in London at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and for some reason I became interested in Harris tweed. This is the best tweed in the universe. You get a scarf or coat made of Harris tweed. It's beautiful. It lasts forever. And I wanted to see where it was made. I knew it was made in Scotland. So I took the train to Edinburgh, rented a car, and drove across Scotland to the Hebrides, which are the islands off Scotland. And that's where all of the wool for the Harris tweed is made and grown and produced. And it's the wool which is then sent to various factories and what have you, so the clothing is made. It's an interesting story. I'll tell you a quick story about my trip across Scotland. It's wonderful. I'm going across Scotland, and it's a beautiful country in northern Scotland. And it's June, and I have on a coat, but it's cold. It's bloody cold. So I stop and
That's
buy
Scotland.
Yeah, so I stop and buy a shawl, scarf, thick scarf, and it was very good. I enjoyed it. It helped me stay warm. I continued on my way. Then I came to a small town, and I'll stop for a quick lunch here, which I did. And as I walked up the path to this restaurant, store, whatever, there was an old woman sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, rocking back and forth, watching every step I took. And as I got closer, she looked up at me and said in that wonderful Scottish accent, "Where you get that scarf from?" And I said, "I bought it just a town over." She said, "Oh," "where you pay for it?" I said, £2. And that old lady shook her head and said, "Hoot, man, they saw you coming." I love that story. I love it.
Oh, I love Scotland, and
It's special. It's a special place. It really
It is a
is.
very special place. So there we have the writing of these books that he started is so fantastic, and you've carried on a wonderful. You've managed to capture that tone, I think, in the writing, in your writing. Explain who the narrator is and how did we get there? How did you decide on who was going to narrate these books?
That's a good question. We should go back just a chapter or two to after the affair between Sherlock and Irene Adler. As I say, Irene goes back to Paris and continues her career. Sherlock goes back to solving mysteries, crimes, what have you. But 8.5 months later, there's a knock on the door at 221B Baker Street. And Holmes answers the door, and standing before him is a very pregnant Irene Adler. She's 8.5 months pregnant. But she's also very ill. She's suffering from the toxemia of pregnancy. Her blood pressure is sky high. Her kidneys are failing. She'll be dead in a matter of weeks. And she's come to see Sherlock to help her with this problem. Now, as I said earlier, Sherlock was really a rather cold-hearted fellow. He had no interest in being a father, and it just didn't appeal to him. He'd never do it. But it was a problem, and he loved to solve problems. So he came up with a solution. He said, this is what we'll do. You'll carry this baby to delivery. You'll be admitted to a fine hospital here in London. The baby will be delivered, and that baby will be put up immediately for adoption. And that way we know the baby will be well taken care of. Irene Adler agrees, and then Holmes says, oh, by the way, I want those photographs of you and the King of Bohemia, which she gives him. He then goes to Bohemia, presents them to the king, and makes up a story. He says, yeah, I got these photographs for you, but they cost me £5,000. I want you to repay me. The king is delighted to do, gives him the £5,000. Holmes returns to London and sets up a trust fund for the newborn child when it's born. With the aid of John Watson, his colleague, everything goes smoothly. Everything. 2 weeks later, Irene goes into labor and delivers a beautiful baby girl, who she names Joanna. But Irene Adler gets to hold and kiss the baby only once before she dies. As promised, the baby is adopted. Holmes and Watson make sure the adoption papers are sealed. They'll never be opened. Nobody will ever know who the father was. Nobody will know. And they set up a trust for the newborn, which makes certain the young girl will always be financially stable. And some years later, Holmes retires and eventually dies, and Watson, his wife, passes away. He moves back to 221B Baker Street, where he assumes the role somewhat of Sherlock Holmes. He's not as good as Sherlock, but people still come to him for advice. And there's a knock on the door, and Watson opens it to a young woman in some distress. Her name is Mary Harrelson. And she's come to see Watson because her brother has died, and he's been said to have committed suicide, which is ridiculous. And she wants Watson to prove otherwise. Watson's not interested in suicide. It's not his cup of tea. But then she says, but there are two stories which are not the same, two witnesses which tell different stories. One of the witnesses was a gardener half a block away, and the other witness was Joanna Blaylock. Watson almost comes out of his chair because he knows Joanna is the daughter of Sherlock Holmes. He's the only person on the face of the earth who knows that Joanna Blaylock is the daughter of Sherlock Holmes. Of course, he takes the case immediately. And the next day, he and his son, John Jr., and John Watson Jr. is a pathologist at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, good-looking, handsome, bright guy, and they go to see Joanna. And Watson says, you and your son yesterday happened to witness a man falling from 3 stories, did you not? And Joanna said, we did. And Watson then says, that's why we're here. We're here to investigate the death of Charles Harrelson. And Joanna smiles humorously and says, "No, Dr. Watson, you're here to investigate the murder of Charles Harrelson." So it's clear right from the beginning that here's this woman who has this deductive mind and reasoning. She already sees what really happened. And she becomes part of the investigating team. And thus is formed the trio of Cecilia Watson Jr. and Joanna. The latter two fall in love and marry, and the three of them live in 221B Baker Street, and that's where all the crimes begin, so as to speak. That's the story in a nutshell.
One of the reasons, and it's a great how you worked it out is just perfect. And one of the reasons I love the books is also I lived in England for a long time, and I was doing research in the reading room at the British Museum. So
Oh, yeah.
I walked Baker Street many times on my way to the museum. Almost every day for 2 years, I was doing research in the reading room. So I'd be thinking as I passed by about Sherlock Holmes stories.
Actually, when I was in London, I lived on Edgware Road, which was 15 minutes away from Sherlock's house on apartment on 221B Baker Street. And I would occasionally stroll by it. And even then, there were people in front of that house, almost in worship, because that's where Sherlock Holmes lived. Quite remarkable.
Exactly. I would see it, and I would be heading off to the museum, and it gives you a tingle still today.
I went to the British Museum so many times, I can't count it. And it always showed me something that I didn't know, something that I'd never seen before. And as you may recall, once you enter, one of the first things is a Rosetta Stone, which broke open the code for hieroglyphics. I always like to stop by that. I was always amazed that here was this stone, 4 feet high, 2 feet wide, and it had broken the code for the hieroglyphs. More information came from that stone than from any other source that we know of. Remarkable.
The British Museum is it's a marvel. Now, did you ever work in the reading room? Did you do research in the reading room?
No. I at the time I was doing research at St. Bartholomew's, and to be honest, most of my time was taken up there. But in one of my novels, I did write about a curator at the British Museum who had fought with Watson in the Second Afghan War. And he was now the head of Mesopotamia transcripts and languages at the British Museum.
Here's another connection to why I love your books. I was doing research in the reading room. It was very difficult to get the permission to be in the reading room.
Oh, yeah.
It was very difficult. And I was a young American girl. I wanted to get in there. Now, they don't just let you. You have to have recommendations from universities. And I went there saying, I need to get in. And they're like, crazy American. I was so young. And in a 30-minute conversation, telling them what books I wanted to read, what research I was doing, 30 minutes later, they walked me into the office and they gave me a card to work in the reading room.
How great.
Where it was so beautiful because you got original books. You sat in a seat and they brought you the books. They brought the books to you. And they'd bring you these old books from the 17th century. And they'd come with them and they'd give them to you and you'd sit there. And what I was researching was the Afghani wars.
Yes.
I was doing research on the Afghani wars for a book I'm writing about India. So it's just amazing.
Absolutely. And of course, Watson was injured, wounded in the Second Afghan War, came back to England, wounded and in poor health, not sure what his future held. He was a former army surgeon, but now he was in bad health. He was dispirited, what have you, living in a hotel, and his funds were running out. But he happened to run into an old friend, and they were talking, and Watson told the friend, I'm living in a hotel now, but it's a bit beyond my means, and I'm looking for an apartment that I could afford. And the friend says, oh, well, I think I may have just the place for you. I have a friend who has very spacious apartments, a good chap, a little unusual, but a good chap. And he desperately wants somebody to share the rooms and share the expense. And Watson says, great, where does this fellow have his rooms? And the response is, why, on Baker Street. And Watson says, does this chap have a name? And the friend says, oh, yes, his name is Sherlock Holmes. And that's how Watson met Sherlock and the start of the great combination of Sherlock and Watson.
Exactly.
Investigating the crime. Yeah, I always thought that was.
I love it. I love the story. Now, of course, the connection here of being a doctor is also very important to Conan Doyle because he went to medical school in Edinburgh.
He became an ophthalmologist.
Ophthalmology wasn't considered as important as a surgeon.
They were at the lower rank. Yeah, they were at the lower rank.
As a young man, were you already reading?
Oh, yeah. When I was 10 years old, I was reading Sherlock Holmes. I don't know what eventually happened. It was a paperback book, very thick because it had all of the adventures. But I read it so many times, it became dog-eared. It was a book I could read over. And then I would either hear it on the radio or watch television, the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And my brother and I would watch or listen. And then we would discuss it. What'd you think about that? How did he know this? Oh, he found this clue, remember? So it became part of my growing up as a youth. I knew Sherlock very well when I was young.
And so there's a lot of doctors involved in this story. So tell us about Dr. Bell.
Dr.
Joseph Bell influenced him, and he also influenced Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yeah, Dr. Bell was a very unusual fellow. He was a distinguished physician at the University of Edinburgh, and he was considered almost to be a wizard because a patient who he'd never seen before, would walk into the auditorium where the patient was to be discussed, and on one glance, Dr. Joseph Bell could tell you a remarkable amount about this fellow. Remarkable. And the first time Arthur Conan Doyle, saw this fellow in action, a patient walked into the room, this auditorium with a bunch of physicians gathered around. And of course, Joseph Bell had never seen the patient before. The patient sits down. Bell looks over to him and says, I see you're from Scotland and you recently retired from the military. And I see you suffer from elephantiasis, which is blockage of the lymphatics in the lower extremities, which causes swelling and massive edema. And he says, and furthermore, I see you were stationed in the Barbados. Now, how in the world could he know all this? It's a wizard. It's his magic. Turns out that the fellow has a Scottish accent. Thus, he's from Scotland. Number two, when he comes into the room, he keeps his hat on, which is what military British officers do. They don't take their hat off when they enter a room. Furthermore, he looks at the chap's legs and sees his elephantiasis due to an infection, which blocks the lymphatics. And Joseph Bell knows that there are only a few places in the world where elephantiasis occurs. And one of those places is the Barbados, where Scotland has a military installation. So he puts it all together, and this fellow is a retired military from Scotland who served in the Barbados. That was the type of genius that Joseph Bell had. Well, Conan Doyle sees this, and he carries it with him for the rest of his life. This is remarkable. What a remarkable detective this would be. And that was a formation for Sherlock Holmes. And Conan Doyle admits to that, by the way.
I was also in Birmingham, where Conan Doyle lived and worked.
Yes, yes. Conan Doyle is just remarkable, just remarkable. Can I share a story with you that most people just don't believe? Did you know that Conan Doyle was a stimulus behind Michael Crichton's major novel? You have any idea about that?
No, tell us.
Michael Crichton wrote a novel called Jurassic Park, a wonderful novel. Everybody read it or saw the movie. And of course, it's about some scientists and paleontologists, what have you, who learned by using genes and DNA to produce dinosaurs. That's the gist of the story. It's done on an island off Costa Rica. And of course, explorers come there, what have you, or the people who created it. The dinosaurs are very unhappy with the situation and attack these humans. 100 years earlier, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a story in which there are explorers in the Amazon who get lost and come to this range of mountains, and they climb one of the mountains, tall peak. When they get to the top, it's inhabited by dinosaurs. This land, this plateau, is untouched for millions and millions of years. And when the dinosaurs see these new explorers, what have you, they attack, they terrorize them. In Arthur Conan Doyle's story, you have explorers lost in the Amazon, finding Amazons atop a mountaintop. In Michael Crichton's novel, you have biogeneticists creating dinosaurs on an island off of Costa Rica. Now, people say, how do you know Michael Crichton copied Conan Doyle? Because he gave evidence of it. The first novel was called Jurassic Park. The follow-up sequel was entitled Jurassic Park, The Lost World. The title of Arthur Conan Doyle's novel in 1927 was The Lost World. I think it was Crichton paying homage to Arthur Conan Doyle, is why he included it in the title. Interesting story.
I think you've got it.
Yeah, it just struck me as, but there's nothing new under the sun. I don't like to quote the scripture, but in fact, I think it's Ecclesiastes that there's nothing new under the sun. What's been done has already been done before, and it's true in literature as well. If someone says, oh, don't write that story, it's the same story has been told. Hell, the same story has been told by everybody 100 times. You want it to be yours? Change the title, change the characters, change the location, change the time, make the circumstances different. Change it, then it becomes yours.
And add some of your own life experiences, because we
Even
all have
better.
we all have different life experiences.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so we look at things differently.
And I think that's what makes authors different, because you have different life experiences and how you react to those experiences.
Now, so let's get back to the new book. Now,
okay.
Book number 8, A Scandalous Affair, is set. Now, you're taking us through World War I, which is so much fun. It is so much fun. So at this point, we are in, we progress. We're in 1918.
Still in World War I. It's nearing the end, but we're still in World War I.
The funny thing is, most people don't even realize that there were bombings in London at that time in World War I. Everybody's heard of the London Blitz during World War II. They know about all of that. They've seen millions of movies. Because of my interest in World War I will tell people about what happened in World War I, and people don't even believe me when I've had people who say, oh no, there was no bombing. My husband was a pilot and an aeronautical engineer. We lived in England. I have visited probably every RAF base in England. And so we would fly all over England and go to every RAF base. So I tell people there were bombings in World War I, and people are surprised. I just wanted to show people this because people don't understand that there were bombings, and they were bombed by this airplane.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There are no Gothas left because under the Treaty of Versailles, they all had to be destroyed. But this is the airplane that bombed London during World War I.
Oh, fantastic.
Isn't it fantastic? And of course, they were also bombed by Zeppelins. And this is a map of the Zeppelin bombings during World War I. And the first bomb of World War I was actually a Zeppelin, which is on the 31st of May in 1915.
Yes, yeah.
So that's one of the reasons I just love these books.
It's remarkable that during World War One there were real bombings, and at the time, of course, the subway, the tube system was in effect, and when the alarm would sound, people would rush to the underground because that was a safe space from the bombs. Now, back in 1918, they didn't have sirens. The way people were warned is a policeman would come by pedaling his bicycle as fast as he could, blowing a whistle and yelling out, "Stand clear, stand clear." And that meant the German bombers were coming. And people would automatically stop what they were doing and begin to make their way towards the bomb shelter or what have you. But they would always have their ears peaked, listening for the drone of the bombers, because as soon as they heard the drone, they knew the bombers were very close, and they broke into a full run to take cover. So it was quite remarkable. And I think in Scandalous Affair, such bombings occurred, I think, twice. And I showed how it really emptied a pub, that everybody was having a jolly good time and what have you in this pub in Canary Wharf, or Canary Wharf, as they say, when the alarm sounded. And they all exited and made haste to get to the underground system. But yes, there were bombings. And some of the bombings were quite effective because the Germans were rather indiscriminate. They looked for factories, what have you, but they didn't bother them. They didn't see any. They just dropped the bombs on civilians, on populated cities, in an effort to break the British spirit, which they never did. But there was a heavy toll, a heavy cost from those bombs.
Exactly. And they didn't break the British spirit. Of course, already we know Joanna, of course, has an extra worry because they have a son. So tell us about that. And of course, the worry about if the Germans would bomb Windsor, where Eton
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Joanna has a son who is now 17 years old, and the son is very bright, and the son also has a deductive mind, very much like Sherlock Holmes. And I should tell you that initially on, when Joanna introduces her son to the elderly Watson, Watson is not positive. Is this really Sherlock's son? He knows the story, what have you, this and that. But Irene Adler was a very popular woman. She was an opera star, and perhaps she had affairs with others. How could Watson know that this is really the son of Sherlock Holmes? Then he's introduced to the boy when he's 10 years old. And again, Watson almost falls out of his chair because that young 10-year-old boy looks exactly like a young Sherlock Holmes. In any event, he grows up, young Johnny, having this remarkably deductive mind, and he does very well in school, and he's at Eton now, which is right across from Windsor. And there's a question as to whether the German Air Force will bomb Windsor, where the palace is at. Wow, what if the German Air Force was to target Windsor and destroy one of England's most famous and cherished castles? But it's said that the Kaiser, who ruled Germany, said, no, you're not to bomb Windsor. It's to be left intact because once we've defeated England, I'm going to make Windsor my home. For the time being, Windsor was left alone. But Joanna was worried that the Germans, they didn't keep to their word all that often, that they might try to bomb Windsor. And of course, some of those bombs could reach Eton, and that's where her son is now a student. So she was very concerned about that.
So just tell us more about this story. I love Joanna. I think what you've done with her over the years, bringing her to this point, I love her, how she does notice things. So you're having a lot of fun writing these books.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the great traits of Sherlock Holmes was he made so much from so little. He could take a trivial clue and really magnify it a dozen times only. And I rather like that. That sort of reminded me of Joseph Bell, who could find the little things and make a great deal out of them. And by the way, it's Joanna's husband, Watson Jr., who narrates the stories. And it's an interesting story, this scandalous affair. Later one evening, Joanna and the Watsons is visited by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Radcliffe, and he comes with a haymaker of a story. He's being blackmailed. You have to remember, this is a wealthy family, but in addition to the wealth, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a very important position in England. It's like head of the Treasury, all the expenditures of the government, tariffs and taxes, they all go through that office. But even more importantly, Chancellor of the Exchequer, in this case, sits on the War Council. And every major military operation that occurs on the continent has to be approved by the War Council. The secrets this fellow has in his mind are vital beyond vital. And every man has his breaking point, and one wonders if eventually the blackmailer will get to this as well. He comes to see Joanna and the Watsons. He desperately needs for the photographs to be obtained, procured, and for the unknown blackmailer to be identified. Now, you got to be very careful here, because if the blackmailer finds out he's now being tracked, or if he is in fact cornered, or if he is in fact arrested, the photographs may become public. And then the Chancellor's family is ruined, as is he. So it has to be done in a very careful fashion. You have to trap this fella, but get the photographs at the same time. And that's the gist of the story. Now you say, what are the clues? What are the major clues? Well, all Joanna's given is a picture, rather salacious picture, of the granddaughter of the Chancellor in a romantic encounter with a man other than the aristocrat she's engaged to marry. And Joanna studies the photographs. And then she finds two clues, which will eventually lead her to this blackmailer. And what are those clues? I'll tell you the clues. You're going to have to figure out how she went about following them. The first clue is the man, a handsome, good-looking fella. He's wearing a silk shirt with a ruffled collar and puffed out sleeves. Type of costume you would see in a Shakespearean play. The second clue is right beside the fellow is a pipe, a white pipe. It has a usual common bowl at one end, but the stem is 3 feet long. What is that about? The first clue, of course, tells you that at least one of the people involved is from a Shakespearean play, so he must be an actor. The second clue is that type of pipe is only seen in one place, in opium dens. Because in opium dens, the customer goes in, is given a pipe, which has this long stem. Customer places opium in the bowl. He lays down on a mat 2 or 3 feet away from a heated lamp. And the bowl is placed over the heated lamp. The heat ignites the opium, and the vapor is then sucked in or inhaled through that long stem. Right from the get-go, Joanna says, we have an actor, and something is happening in an opium den. Something in an opium den is critical. And those are the two clues that she has to follow, which she does.
And she does. And that's the wonderful thing about all of these books. And you've tackled hard subjects along the way, whether it's blackmail. We started off all the way back to when Irene's very first adventure, where we have photographs. And of course, in the other book, one of the books, you cover abortion and illegitimacy and all of this. So you go right there, and sometimes it's a little bit dark, but you just go right into it and create fascinating stories out of all of these different adventures that you get these people in.
One reviewer, I think she was Champlain, Illinois. She wrote a line which I really liked. She said, "The Goldbergs takes you to the dark side of London, but don't worry, it's fun and you'll enjoy the trip." I rather like that.
Yeah, well, it is true. I mean, you do take us sometimes to the dark side, but whether it's with drugs or anything else, you make it alive and you make us want to know more and keep turning the pages. So you've achieved that, and it's wonderful. And the new book, A Scandalous Affair, which is number 8, it's really, I think it reads so well. It's so much fun to read, and it's just a continuation of what you've done. You really created. I know you've gone in the past. You've had some other works, and you've had sometimes where they've optioned it to do scripts and stuff. But you've added a freshness to the story, and there are lots. There have been a lot of Sherlock Holmes kind of picture, streaming video, whatever. But I think you've added a depth to it, and it might be partly because you're a doctor, so you look at things in a very special way. And I hope that this hasn't been optioned yet, has it? Because I'd love this
Not
series.
yet, but
I'd love to see who's going to play Joanna.
I got 2 people who are very interested. Whether anything comes of it, I don't know. But one of the people mentioned this woman who I've seen who's a very good actress, Scarlett Johansson, who she said would make a great Joanna. I don't know. I'll have to wait and see. But it'll be interesting to see it on the screen. I would like that very much.
I think so. I think the twists that you put in it, the depth, because there's also a lot. You bring things out that most people don't know, whether it's the bombing in World War I, which people don't know. So this is right there cinematic. But there's so many. One of the things, I worked in Hollywood for a little while. I adapted some books to film. And I have to admit, I don't know if any of those authors are listening, but they didn't give me a lot to work with. If you get a book and you read the book and they want you to put it into a film, you say, "Oh my gosh, there's not enough. I don't have enough." And you end up doing the research. And in this case, any scriptwriter who gets these books will say, "Oh, thank you." They will just bow down. They'll say, "Oh, Len, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've given us too much. Stop it already. There's too much. What are we going to do with all of this?"
One of the interesting crossovers, if you will, was in the year 1917, 1918, the carriages were being put aside and the automobile was taking over. The cobblestone streets were being paved over. So here we have this transition occurring with people who once were going around in hansoms and carriages, now going around in taxis and automobiles. So it was interesting to mix the two together. I rather enjoy doing that.
That's it. I mean, there's so much just visually that will be appealing in a streaming video. Many episodes we'll watch and we'll see that development of what happens from the beginning, like from 1914 on through these years, the developments, the changes, the things that happen. And you've given this material there. It's part of all the research you've done, because you've done a lot of research here.
You have to. You have to go back to the years 19, 15, 16, 17, and you literally have to put your place in their place. What was life like back then? And particularly during wartime. Life takes on a different flavor during war. There's deprivation, people are dying. Your life is controlled to a large extent by events. And there's one interesting part of the novel which I had to do a fair amount of research on. British soldiers in the first fighting were being terribly wounded and maimed. And one of the worst things that could happen was when a shell exploded nearby, and it would disfigure them badly. And of course, they would come back to England with these disfigured faces. And People more or less tried to tolerate it, but they really had difficulty with it. And they were known as broken faces. And there was a wife of a physician. She was an artist. Her name escapes me right now. But she became very much aware of this problem. And she created faces for these people. And what she would do was to take a mold of their face, correct the imperfection, then make a copper mask, cover it with enamel, which was very much skin-like, used human hair for eyebrows or mustache, and you could attach this partial face with the use of rubber bands behind the ears. So in public, these people appeared normal. It was only when that copper mask was removed that you saw the hideous disfiguration. I forget her name, but it was interesting that she went to that extent to help these people. Sometimes interesting stories come from terrible events.
At that point that we started to understand PTSD of what these guys were coming back from Europe with mustard gas poisoning and how that affected them so badly. There was a whole generation of young men who came back who suffered PTSD because of the mustard gas.
Oh yeah, they had permanent injuries. There's no question about it. World War One, Hollywood, of course, didn't have talkies in the movies or what have you. So we didn't have the movies that you saw in World War II, in which people were brave and Americans always won, or the Allies, and it rarely showed the terrible consequences of war. But they were there. It's just they didn't show them. Now, you didn't see them in World War One because there were no movies back then. They had them, but there were no talkies and not that well attended or what have you. War has a terrible cost. Win or lose, it has a terrible cost. And it did in our country, and it did in England.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, in the part of your research, it's not just that you had to learn about the clothes, the food, the restaurants, where people went to eat, where people lived. So tell us some of that research. That's fun. I know London very well. I spent a lot of time just walking the streets and learning about London. But then when you're looking at it from the point of view, what was it like during World War One? How did you find that process?
Actually, I had a friend, a colleague at St. Bart's, who was very familiar with London neighborhoods. And he told me which parts had stayed relatively unchanged over the wars. In much of London, it stayed unchanged, except those places which were badly bombed, of course. But it's not like America. They build a building in London, they expect it to last for 1,000 years. We build a house in America, we hope it lasts for 40 years. It's just a different mentality. But again, you have to place yourself back in the era or the time. And when I was in London, I did part of my research at a hospital in Bath. It was called the Min, which of course stood for the Royal Mineral Hospital. And once when I was up there was a chap who had lived through World War One. He had actually fought in World War One. He was in his 80s or 90s, whatever it was. And I had some very interesting chats with him. And he remembered London back then. He lived not far from where I worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The area was where St. Paul's is at and what have you. And that gave me a fair amount of insight into what London was. And then you have to go back in the libraries and get the pictures and go to Prince Albert Museum and see the dress that was used, the men's clothing, this and that. So it requires a fair amount of research. And you better get it right, because if you make an error, the reader will let you know.
The women's clothes, the change from the beginning of World War One to the end of World War One was absolutely dramatic.
Oh, yeah.
The clothes change so much.
I think a lot of things changed rapidly in those 4 or 5 years. Part of it, I believe, was the connection these countries suddenly had with one another. Like suddenly America and England were very close. And even though the French and the British were often at each other's throats, they had a commonality. They had a mutual desire for certain things. And I recall I went to one of the grand department stores in England, Fortnum and Mason, and I went to the cosmetic section because I was buying a gift for somebody. And I spoke with one of the sales clerks, a young woman, very attractive, had the face of an elf, a sweet woman. And we were talking about the items which were from France. And she gave me a history that one of the famous cosmetic firms in France, Coty, C-O-T-Y, had been sending their goods, their products to Fortnum and Mason for almost 100 years. This crossover had occurred very rapidly, particularly during the World Wars. And I think that accounted for the quick change. But then in America, we change quickly too, don't we? A new fad comes in, everybody changes. How long did it take before suddenly people wanted to wear bell-bottom trousers, which I always thought were rather hideous? But in a matter of months, suddenly everybody was wearing bell-bottom trousers. Things change. And as a friend of mine once told me, you have to live with change that's going to occur. And if you can't tolerate change, then you best go live in a monastery because change is going to happen.
What is some of your favorite fan experiences? Because you have a lot of fans.
I remember I was at a book signing. I think it was in Illinois, but I'm not, might have been somewhere else some time ago. And I had a very good turnout. And this young woman in the back row stood up, sweet one, and said, "Dr. Goldberg, how do you write a novel?" And I often remember that question was once given to Eudora Welty, a famous Southern writer, at a signing in Mississippi, and some young girl stood up and said, "Miss Welty, how do you write a novel?" And her memorable response was, "First, you got to sit down." And it's true. Everybody wants to write a novel. They just don't want to start. They don't want to sit down and pick up a pen and begin. I can't do it. I don't have the time, this, that. Find a dozen reasons, but they never really try. And the only way you'll find out if you've got writer in you is to try. See if you can write. You'll say, "What should I do to start?" I tell them, look, write a paragraph, the first paragraph of what you think a novel should be. Then put it aside for a week or two. Then come back and read that paragraph. And you'll see you made mistakes. This verb was not a good verb, too many adjectives here, and you'll change it around. And then put it aside for another week or two. Then take a novel by your favorite writer and take a paragraph which you think is just sparkling, and take that paragraph, read it over and over again, and use that style to change your original paragraph. See what you end up with. You might be surprised.
That is exactly what people have to do. I love it. Writers work hard. You're not a robot. You have to actually put so much thought into it, and the research in your case, because you're doing a period piece. It's a lot of work, but it is fun work, isn't it?
It is, and I often tell people that you'll know you're a writer when you know the beginning of the novel and you know the end. And then you start to write. But you don't know what's going to happen in the middle. that's when the novel takes you along.
And having those surprises, having a character take over sometimes for you and tell you where to go, it's
Oh,
magical.
that's the part. That's the part of writing which is so good. The first couple of three chapters are difficult, no question about it. You got to get this boat floating. But once you start, then the characters take over. And you simply are a voyeur. You watch, you write it down, but they're doing what they want to do. And again, that's when writing becomes fun, when the story takes you along rather than you taking the story along.
With your great interest in Conan Doyle, have you bought anything of his? Have you bought collector's editions of his books? Every once in a while, they'll have an auction and something related to him. So, have you ever done that?
I haven't as yet, but I'm very tempted to. I have bought repeatedly these volumes of Sherlock Holmes by Conan Doyle because I found that some of them are so wonderfully printed with wide letters and what have you. It makes for easier reading. So whenever a new edition comes out, I buy it. And if by chance, excuse me, it's hardcover and not paperback, I buy it because I know that the paperback will stay and will remain. Paperbacks, they go, like your copy of Transplant, you lose track. But a hardcover, that becomes property and you hold on to it.
If you have any hanging around the house, they're selling for $100 each now.
Actually, I've got one copy of Transplant, and it's interesting. My mom, she lived in a big condominium complex in Charleston, and she used to read, of course, and she went down to the library one day, this was back in the 1990s, and lo and behold, on the table was a copy of Transplant in pretty good shape. Of course, she grabbed it, and she had never read it, and she read it, and she said, "Oh, Len, that's a really good novel," etc. And she told me how she found it, and I said, "Hold on to that, Mother." She said, "The only problem was the person who it belonged to initially had written their name on one of the pages." I said, "Doesn't matter. You hold on to it." Anyhow, when my mom passed, this was some 20 years ago, and I had to pack up her goods and what have you, I came across that novel.
Most of my books, I would say, come from Oxford, from the old bookstores. I have some that came from great houses, famous houses, because servants would sometimes steal books. They would sell them for a few shillings, and
Oh, yeah.
in those days, because they'd steal a book from some famous house in England, everybody's house had a name, and it's inside, and I love that. That gives me such a thrill to actually have a name. I bought a book in England, and inside the person's name was, they were here in Texas. It was somebody who was in Texas. She had written her name in, and she was on a trip to Europe. And somehow she left it behind and was in a bookstore, and I found it. And so when I moved to Texas, I looked on Google Maps to see the little town where she came from, and she'd gone all the way to London with that book. I don't know if you write in your book. I do sometimes, very delicately.
Every now and then I will read a passage in a novel which just strikes me as being so well done, just point on, and it brings out features that I hadn't done in the past. And I know that sometime, somewhere along the way, I'm going to write a similar chapter, similar paragraph. So what I do is I take one of these Post-its and stick it on that page. So years from now, when I say, "Gee, I remember reading something like this in Clavel's Shogun," I get out that novel. It may have 5 or 6 of those Post-its. One of them has that paragraph.
This is so important for people who want to be writers, that they need to read and do little things like that. Make notes of great paragraphs you read, put a little marker in there, and go back and study it.
Yeah, other writers who are trying or beginning to write, is always have pencil and paper at your bedside. Because sure as there's a sun in the sky, some thought will come to your mind, whether it's about a novel or the title of a novel or a character or whatever. And if you're half asleep, you always say, well, I'll remember it in the morning. And of course, you never do. And my advice is have pencil and paper by your bedside. Wake up and just write yourself a brief note of what that thought was.
You've been able to meet many famous authors. Do you still try to get their autograph in a book?
Only one. I didn't have to try to get the autograph. After leaving UCLA, I'd been on the faculty at UCLA for 15 years, and I decided time to go out into private practice, which I'm glad I did because I could allot my time more to medicine and writing. But one of the patients in our practice was James Clavell, who wrote Shogun. And, excuse me, I was sitting next to Clavell at a dinner party, very charming fellow. We had a good chat. He told me something that I didn't know. As you recall, Shogun was about an English seafarer who gets shipwrecked off of the coast of Japan, lives in Japan, becomes a samurai, and what have you. Excuse me. And I thought it was a grand idea. And he told me, he said, it wasn't my idea. He said it actually occurred back in the 16th century because I was shown a small discourse on the fellow who it happened to. And the discourse was entitled Samurai William. An Englishman's name was William Adams. As I said earlier, ideas, they come from elsewhere. They come from here and there. You just grab a hold of it and make it your idea.
You have to notice things, notice how they move, how they talk. You have to make little notes to yourself if you hear an interesting story. And you certainly did that over the years. I just love the idea that you worked at St. Bart's because, again, that's another place that I walked past many times.
I remember once I was walking down, the lab I worked in was on the basement at St. Bart's. And I was walking down the basement, it's dark and a little misty, and that's where the morgue is located. And I remember once thinking, as I listened to my own footsteps, I wondered if Sherlock and Watson had traveled down the same aisle, going to the morgue to study a body and find out what really had happened to this person. It rang in my head back then.
Probably Conan Doyle did too.
No doubt, no doubt.
If you're going to go look at a morgue, St. Bart's is a great place.
It's a place to go.
It is. Actually, there's nothing, I think it is, I love a hospital at night, and I love walking in the corridors at night. As I said, I was a medical tech, and so
Yeah.
I would be there, and I would be walking down the hallway, and it gives you a very special outlook on life. When you go past the morgue, I didn't have to go in it very often, but you go past the morgue, and as you said, you hear your footsteps.
You do indeed. Not as much today as it was back a few years or some years ago. But hospitals are still special places. There's a certain aura about a hospital. And the people who work there and what they know and the secrets they keep and the things they've done or haven't done, which they can never talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
I often think of that.
Yeah, you do. When you're in a hospital and you're working in a hospital, and you're right, it's not, I think, quite the same. But I know when I did, there was this special feeling. You felt grateful. You felt really the souls around you. You felt like there were souls floating around there. It's not unrealistic to think of horror stories where they have scary scenes, because there is something about it stays there. And the people, and especially at night in a hospital, the people are different. They act differently. And I like the way, and then when something happens, an accident happens, a disaster, and everyone swings into action, and you don't have the full crew. Not every you don't need everybody that you need isn't there, and suddenly all the people in the hospital swing into action. That is a special moment.
Yeah, it's called All Hands on Deck.
Yeah,
And it usually happens at night.
yeah,
And if you've ever worked in an emergency room where there's been a mass casualty of some sort, that occurs.
yeah,
There are only so many beds, only so many people. Um, Choices have to be made. It's
yeah.
not easy.
It is a different thing, and when you're working in the lab and suddenly everybody has to just rush and you go out of your comfort zone at that point.
Oh, yeah.
You capture so much in your books. I just love it. I love the entire period. As I said, World War One is fascinating. You've carried this through, and the characters they've taken over. And that's a nice thing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. That's how it's supposed to be.
That's it.
It's the characters, not you. It's the characters.
Yeah.
If you think about novels that you've read, it's the characters which stick with you. Of course, we all know about Gone with the Wind, but who doesn't know about Rhett Butler? You read a Charles Dickens novel or book, who doesn't know about Scrooge or Tiny Tim? The characters, they just stick, they stay. By the way, Dickens is my favorite when it comes to naming characters.
Oh,
Nobody even comes
nobody can. Oh.
You think about it, Scrooge and Tiny Tim and the Artful Dodger. It's remarkable.
And Pip.
I mean, even yeah,
Pip was always my favorite. I loved that name
yeah.
when I was a kid.
Or the fellow who had the orphanage, well, Oliver Twist. I love that name, Oliver Twist. Well, Oliver Twist was housed, and his name was Mr. Bumble. I don't know where Dickens got these names from. I was once in a shop. It was on Bond Street or near Bond Street in London, and they had sweaters. I've never seen so many sweaters in my life. Goodness gracious, there were rows and rows of sweaters. And I guess everybody of any note had gone to this shop or whatever to buy sweaters. And in one of the walls, there was a picture, a framed picture of a check for a sweater signed by Charles Dickens. I rather like that.
So that's where we come back to Sherlock Holmes. We have Sherlock Holmes. And many people have played him over the years, but do you have a favorite actor who's played him?
Initially, it was Basil Rathbone, but in more modern times, beyond any doubt, it was that Brent fella. I forget his full name now. Jeremy Brent. He was superb. He really captured it. And his Watson was perfect. As you may recall, in the earlier Basil Rathbone portrayals, Watson was looked at as a bumbling dunce, which of course he wasn't, not in Conan Doyle's novels. But in Jeremy Brent's Sherlock Holmes, Watson was a colleague, a sounding board, just as Conan Doyle had portrayed him as being. But yeah, I think that the Jeremy Brent just strikes my mind. I thought he was superior.
Absolutely brilliant. He captured every nuance, the movement, exactly. I think it was perfection.
Yeah. It always stuck with me.
Yeah, and some of the modern versions I don't like. But so when eventually you're optioned and you get at least to select Watson, you won't make him into a bumbling fool.
No, he can't be. He has to be what Conan Doyle wanted him to be, a sounding board. And that was Watson's. Of course, Watson was the chronicle, the guy who chronicled the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. But even Sherlock said that nothing so clarifies a puzzle as stating it to another individual. So he knew how important Watson was. Watson was quite a fellow.
Well, you're quite a fella. Maybe you can take the part. Who knows? We'll see you in a streaming video.
I'll raise my hand.
You would be ideal, I think. You'd be a great Watson Senior.
I wouldn't mind it at all.
It's so wonderful. I'm really so happy that I got to talk to you. I think the book is fantastic, a scandalous affair. It's available starting May 4th.
No, March 4th.
May. March 4th. I know.
Yeah,
March 4th. You know why I was thinking May? Because Conan Doyle was born in May.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
I've been thinking about doing a special birthday program about him. Of
yeah.
course, I will feature you as one of the ones that people should read if they're interested in Conan Doyle.
I'd be delighted.
So March 4th is the release of book number 8, and I hope you're working on the next one.
I am indeed, and about halfway finished, but it's coming along nicely, and it's now picking up speed, so I'm in the fun part of it. So I suspect it'll go well over the next couple, 3 months.
I'm sure it will, and I'm looking forward to it. And here's your website. It's just leonardgoldberg.com. You captured that name, which is good because there are a lot of Leonard Goldbergs.
Yes.
Do you do events? Do you go to conventions anymore? Do you do any of
No.
those?
No, I will go to book signings. I will do Zooms like we're doing here, that kind of thing. But the day of going on a tour, I'm afraid those days have come to an end because you go on a book tour, maybe you have a signing, you have 30, 40, 50 people there. Whereas your publisher knows they get on the right social media site, they can reach 500,000 people by pushing a button.
The process of flying anywhere, it's such a hassle that it's not worth it.
I recall once, I was in 5 or 6 different cities, whatever. I'd be in a city for a day, and then that night we'd fly out, or the next morning we'd fly out, because I'd have a meeting and interviews and signings, and then I never knew what time of day it was. It wears you out. Initially, it has a fun part to it, but after a while,
in the beginning, it's fun, but they don't do that anymore. Mary Higgins Clark once told me when she started off and she became a best-selling author, in those days, the publisher, of course, would fly first class. They would send some young guy from the publishing house just starting off, and he would go with her, and he would handle everything. He would handle her luggage. He would handle taking her to the hotel, getting her to places. And she said it was so much fun to travel first class and stay in first class hotels. They'd always have a suite. And then she said, as the years went on, it got less and less. And she said, I'm not going anymore. You don't fly me first class and you don't give me some young kid to carry my bags. I'm not going.
The best they would do is when you land, somebody meets you to take you around to the various places. And I'm not sure they did it as a courtesy. I think they did it to make sure you got there on time.
Exactly.
But again, it was fun while it lasted.
That's it. It was a fun experience.
But I'm afraid those days.
I have to ask, before you mentioned Fortnum and Mason, of course, if you go to London, you have to go to London. What was your favorite hotel in London?
My favorite hotel in London was Connaught, and I'll tell you why. The Connaught has the best dining room in all of London. Nothing even approaches it. Yeah, I used to go there for lunch. This is an interesting story. They knew me because I came there like every Wednesday, or just about every Wednesday, for one of their great lunches. It was their Dover sole was just out of sight. Anyhow, one Wednesday I was there, and sitting at a table adjacent to me was Lord Rothschild, who of course is widely known, upper class of the upper class, what have you. And I heard him order the pretty Dover sole. And the waiter came over and said, greeted me, how you doing, what have you. And he said, what will it be today, sir? And I said in a loud voice, I think I'll follow Lord Rothschild. Make it the Dover sole. and Rothschild looked over at me and gave me a slight wave. That was one of my more interesting experiences. But if I had to pick another hotel that was centrally located, little on the expensive side, but nonetheless, it would be the Intercontinental, which is at the southeast eastern border of Hyde Park. And the reason I liked it is because it was well within walking distance of Piccadilly or Regent Square or Knightsbridge. It was really, for the west side of London, I would prefer the Intercontinental. But again, lunch at the Connaught, it was really special.
Here's another connection. I worked for the Hotel Intercontinental.
Did you really?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't work in the London branch. I worked in other cities, but I worked for the Hotel Intercontinental.
The service was excellent there.
Oh, excellent. Hotel Intercontinental's the best.
Yeah, it was.
Still, I think of all the chains, it's the best chain. It is.
Yeah, I think if given a choice, that's where I would prefer to stay. Again, the service is just outstanding.
That's I remember what we pride ourselves in. That's what we.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we pride in. And I love. Yeah. Why did you mention Dover Sole? I wish you hadn't mentioned Dover Sole. I love Dover Sole, and you don't get it anywhere. London is the home of Dover Sole.
You're exactly right, and I was told. I mentioned this to a London, an English person, and she told me that the reason is because that Dover Sole, which you have in London, has been out of the sea 3 or 4 hours.
Exactly. You cannot order Dover Sole anywhere else. Not even in Paris. It is not fresh. And it's definitely never order Dover Sole in New York. It is not fresh. I'm telling you. It is not.
That's right. Oh, it's been frozen 3 times over. No, whenever I go to London, there are a few restaurants which I know to go to, and I know the Dover Sole is going to just be spectacular. I just know it.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's funny. I can go to London, and I will go to a fine restaurant and have Dover Sole. And then the next day, I might go to just a little shop in a rundown neighborhood and find the fish and chip shop and order fish and chips. In England, what we'd call the cheap place, fish and chips is fantastic. And you do not find anything like that in America.
Oh, I recall I'd go to the opera in Covent Garden. Oh. It was great, wonderful, La Traviata, La Boheme, whatever it was. But afterwards, of course, everybody was nicely dressed for the opera. But afterwards, we would stop at the fish and chips shop. And of course, it comes wrapped up in a newspaper. And we walk along eating fish and chips. It was just great. I always thought it was good.
And it was a real newspaper. It wasn't like one of these printed stuff they do now.
One had been read, I could tell.
Exactly. It was a used. It wasn't it was a used.
Right.
It was. And it was so good. There's nothing like it. Even now, if I flew to London, probably the first place I would go would be to fish and chips. And I'd hope that probably by law now, they don't let you use real newspapers anymore. I'm sure they've ruined everything.
And I think the chip and chip shops are gradually disappearing.
Yeah.
Like everything else in the modern era. But if you can find one while you're there, go for it.
I agree. I agree.
It's just special.
Len, it's just so wonderful to talk to you. I'm so grateful. You've given me a lot of time here, and it's just a joy. You are a real joy. Your books are just wonderful. Really, thank you so very much.
Thank you for inviting me, and I must tell you, I had a grand time. I just love talking about London with somebody who knows it, who I can chat with about it, and it was fun. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and you're going to be back when the next book is out. Okay?
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Thank you again. Everybody, please go to, first of all, the books are available wherever good books are sold, if there are still wonderful bookstores in your area. If not, they're available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, of course, and you can go to leonardgoldberg.com and find out more. And then you just have to come back here as soon as Len comes out with the next book, because we're going to be right here on Joy on Paper Live. Thank you. And by the way, I'm going to be celebrating the 10th anniversary of Joy on Paper on St. Patrick's Day. You're a very special guest for me, so I'm very grateful.
I'll remember that, and I will raise a pint to your
Oh, yeah,
anniversary.
definitely raise a pint for me on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
Thank you
Great.
again very much.
My pleasure. Bye now.
Okay, bye now. Wow, what an interview. Oh, I had so much fun. What can I do? I love talking about England. I love talking about I love talking about Sherlock Holmes. I've walked in his footsteps. I've walked in Conan Doyle's footsteps. I even think I've walked now in Leonard Goldberg's footsteps because we traveled around the same parts of London. Oh, just thinking about London, as I said, it's so crazy when you've lived in England and you've lived in particularly in London and you get to talk about cod or fish and chips. You're a happy person. So, and of course Fortnum and Mason and Harrods and all the other wonderful places that I know that Len walked in to, all of these places that I walked into, and it was just fun talking to him. And the book, A Scandalous Affair, it's one of these books that what I love is to study history. I read history. I read big history. I have probably 200 books about World War One. Half of them are probably written by Churchill because I love anything written by Churchill. But I also love these smaller books, easier books, an entry into history. So if you read a book like this, if you read this series, you're learning about World War One. You're learning about the people, about the time, about how people thought, about how people worked, about how people lived. And that's the fun thing. That's the wonderful thing about being a reader. You can just dip your toe in. This series about Sherlock Holmes' daughter, it's a tiptoe. You're tiptoeing into history. Once you get there and you start getting familiar with the names, the places, and what the events were, then you might find yourself saying, I want to know a little bit more about this. I want to understand this. I want to understand perhaps the politics of the period. I want to understand more of the history of the period. So this is a sort of tiptoeing through the tulips. But in this case, you're tiptoeing through London and you're learning so much along the way. And it's just fun. The entire book it's just well written. And it's just a great read. Get this book and you can go back and start at the beginning. And I don't know if you can still buy Transplant, which was written back in 1980. Gee, I wish I had saved that paperback book. Anyway, have a wonderful day. I want you see how cheerful I get when I talk to an author. I love talking to authors. I love hearing their stories. And what I love is hearing about how their characters take over. And this happens. And I don't know if you want to write a book. I don't know if you're dreaming about writing a book. But do exactly what Len suggested. Write that first paragraph, put it aside, then go back and do that a couple of times. And then you say, when you get to the point, actually, what happens, if you write you get to the point, you write a whole chapter and then don't read it for a while. Just do something else for a week and go back and you say, and you read it and you say, did I write that? And you're so surprised. It's almost like it's fresh. You say, did I write that? Did I really? I had that in me. And then you realize, yes, you have it in you and you can do it. You can write. And all you have to do is, as he said, sit down in that chair and start writing. But meanwhile, it helps if you start reading. Because if you read, if you have that background, you've been reading books, they're in your head, they're all in there somewhere. Everything you need, every word you need. You don't need a fancy program to give you more words. You don't need to do any of this stupid stuff. And I'm really telling you, do not use these programs that correct you. Do not do it to yourself. Don't cheat yourself. Just write, and you will learn from your own writing, and you'll learn from reading well. That's all I can say to you because I'm having so much fun, and I have to stop now because I've got to stop talking. My throat is going. But that, as you can see, this is real joy on paper, and now it's joy on YouTube. And I'm starting to get better at this. It's YouTube thing is all very difficult for me, but I want to just encourage you to read, to write, and to mostly just find joy in life. And one of the ways to do that is to get outside and read. Take your book, get a hammock, get a comfortable chair, sit under a tree and read. Please get a book and start with this one. It's called A Scandalous Affair. And meanwhile, please subscribe. Just subscribe. It's really easy. Thank you. Bye-bye now.